Now, the event that really brought to light the political machinations behind numerous Democratic Party administrations and their respective members in the House and Senate came to be called the Ostend Manifesto, which was a secret communication that was made public and really exposed the ongoing and continuation of identical policies that had been implemented first in the annexation of Texas and later with the Mexican-American War. So Cuba had long been a target for the slave power. And reason for that was it was very close to the southern states, and it was already and had been deeply entrenched in slavery, actually, for at least as long as colonial America, and probably prior. As a Spanish territory, they had been the first to import slaves into the newly discovered world. So, to kind of foreshadow what the Ostend Manifesto was, before we get into kind of the procession of events that led up to it, it outlined a plan, a system, where first secretive meetings were to be held between various members of the now Pierce administration, still a Democrat administration, to attempt to purchase Cuba from Spain. And if those should fail, there were other options open, one of which was inciting a slave insurrection to create enough conflict and crisis that would be used to justify then military involvement by the United States. So a Mexican-American War situation. And through that or other means, largely the citing of the Black Warrior Affair, which we'll cover shortly, as another potential means of justifying military occupation. So the pattern for the Democrat administration and the slave power of using really the military forces, the U.S. government, in pursuit of protecting and expanding slavery. So for the governing Democratic Party philosophy at the time and Calhounism, that had become the kind of modus operandi. Fortunately, in this case at least, a combination of sober-minded diplomats and then someone who leaked this document thwarted attempts to potentially instigate another war, this time against the Spanish Empire. Now, Pierce, whenever he delivered his inaugural address, he made no secrets as to what his intentions were. Part of this speech is, and I quote, "The policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. Indeed, it is not to be disguised that our attitude as a nation and our position on the globe render the acquisition of certain possessions not within our jurisdiction eminently important for our protection, if not in the future essential for the preservation of the rights of commerce and the peace of the world. Should they be obtained, it will be through no grasping spirit, but with a view to obvious national interest and security, and in a manner entirely consistent with the strictest observance of national faith." Of course, that last line would prove to be, to be gentle, utter crap. Deception was the governing philosophy of the day, and had been at least since the annexation of Texas. Now, what's interesting about this relatively short passage from a much larger speech is, to his credit, Pierce hits on the major points and punctuates them very well. Note specifically his use of the word expansion, although he didn't specify slave expansion. He's conflating the expansion of slave territories with the expansion of the nation as a whole, which is ironic because the slave power consider themselves at this point already to be unrelated to the Union as far as shared prosperity goes. That was one of the major arguments presented during the debate between Hayne and Daniel Webster, and Hayne posited as much. But he he conflates those two, which is important. But then he also says that this acquisition of these unspecified territories would be for our protection, if not in the future essential for the preservation of rights in Congress and peace of the world. And then he mentions national interest again. So he's, very masterfully interweaving the interests of slave protection and expansionism into national interest. And you can see how if someone didn't already understand the underlying purpose of these policies, it's quite persuasive. He harkens a lot on national pride and dignity, honor, expansionism, which were all things that were largely supported by the American people. But this reclassification of slave expansionism into a national security interest and national defense interest would prove to be a very dangerous thing. Now, prior to leaving office, President Polk had initially attempted to purchase Cuba from Spain, and Pierce intended to restart those negotiations, of course. And as we will later discover as we go through the manifesto itself, the failure of these diplomatic attempts would, just like the Mexican-American War had, necessitate some type of military involvement. So an opportunity actually presented itself with the Black Warrior Affair, which really was a trivial event, but it was a godsend for those pro-slavery Democrats waiting for an opportunity to attempt to annex, purchase, or invade Cuba. And the event itself was fairly simple. It was an American steamer ship called the Black Warrior. It docked in Cuba. It didn't have the right paperwork, and so it was impounded. Of course, Southern newspapers and Democrat politicians immediately just erupted with cries of, this is an assault on America, this is an act of war. They just ran with kind of those guiding principles of elevating and escalating the language in the hopes of arousing the passions of the American people, and again pushing for military involvement, just as they had against Mexico. They also began to spread rumors and propaganda claiming that Cuba would succumb to their slaves in much the same way that Haiti had. And then that moral contagion of sorts would spread to the southern states, and we'd have a massive slave insurrection in the southern states as well. So, seemingly ignorant to their own history, all of these claims, although possessing some truth, they just reflect warnings that were presented by framers and architects of the founding documents and the founding doctrine, who warned repeatedly that slavery was, in fact, a moral contagion that effectively weakens the state, and while also weakening the society that practices it, that it is a corrupting influence on the master and a depressing influence on the slave. I write about this extensively, actually, throughout the 1787 project, specifically in the first 3 volumes. So this brings us finally to the Ostend Manifesto itself. So there's going to be some names here. The names are really not that important, other than that they are disgraceful historical figures. But since diplomatic efforts to purchase Cuba failed, as we can assume, and the Black Warrior Affair actually ended very well. There were very sober and reasonable men on the side of Spain and the side of America that were involved in negotiations. And at the end of the day, Spain apologized, returned our vessel, and they even provided compensatory damages. So there really couldn't have been a better outcome. Of course, this was upsetting to those who wished to use war to spread slavery. So there was several clandestine communications at this time. One such communication was sent by William L. Marcy, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And he sent this secretive communication to Pierre Soule. He was a pro-annexation Democrat, and he had been appointed as the minister to Spain by President Pierce, a political appointment. He was a pro-expansionism, pro-slavery Democrat, just as Pierce was. And so similar to the use of General Taylor to instigate a war with Mexico, Pierce wanted to have party guys, party men in positions of power. So in this specific communication, the Secretary of State, Marcy, instructs Soule to secretly offer $130 million to purchase Cuba. Now, the more interesting part, other than, again, one has to question where is this $130 million going to come from? He also knows that if this attempt should fail, that Soule was to direct your effort to the next desirable object, which is to detach that island from the Spanish dominion from all dependence on any European power. So the goal was to implement efforts that would isolate Cuba away from Spain and any other European powers, obviously to set up either the instigation of a slave insurrection or some other event that would then justify military involvement or annexation by America. Now, 3 American diplomats met in Ostend, Belgium, which Ostend Manifesto gives you a pretty good clue on the connection there. And the purpose of their plan was to discuss strategy for how they could acquire Cuba. So this group of 3 was consisted of James Buchanan, who was a minister to Great Britain, and he had also been the failed messenger who tried to purchase Cuba under the Polk administration. Another man by the name of John Y. Mason, who was the minister of France, and of course Pierre Soule, which we've already met, who was the Spanish minister. And they were supposed to meet, compare notes, brainstorm, come up with a list of possibilities, and then return those to President Pierce and to Secretary of State William Marcy. Now this communication, this plan that they came up with, that is what is referred to as the Ostend Manifesto. Now what's particularly harrowing about this manifesto is that it reads as an expose of sorts for the intentions of the Democratic Party to pursue the expansion of slavery through extra-legal and unconstitutional means. They reiterate repeatedly security concerns with the domination of Cuba by Spain. And I guess their assumption was that all of these concerns would just magically disappear if America was to annex Cuba. So it's not it's not clear if these were the opinions of these men or if they were addressing kind of a focus grouping, what kind of messaging should be used to validate actions. So one passage from this manifesto reads, "Indeed, the Union can never enjoy repose nor possess reliable security as long as Cuba is not embraced within its boundaries. The system of immigration and labor lately organized within its limits, and the tyranny and oppression which characterize its immediate rulers, threaten an insurrection at every moment, which may result in direful consequences to the American people. Cuba has thus become to us an unceasing danger and a permanent cause of alarm." So we see packaged into this rather small paragraph all of the justifications that had already been used for the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, with the added kind of sensationalist language concerning slave insurrections. Now, one thing they also explore is beyond the obvious kind of shared understanding that slave expansionism was a necessity, was the potential of initiating or hijacking any political or civil unrest in Cuba as a pretense for military occupation. And they write specifically about the Black Warrior Affair, They write, recently, a most flagrant outrage on the rights of American citizens and on the flag of the United States was perpetrated in the harbor of Havana, under circumstances which, without immediate redress, would have justified a resort to measures of war in vindication of natural honor. And so they're describing, oh darn, we had the opportunity there that we could have initiated war, but that affair was actually very short-lived. Now, this manifesto is quite lengthy, but it was ultimately leaked and came into the possession to the public. Then, as soon as that occurred, inquisitions originating in the House of Representatives began. The Ostend meeting was condemned. Soule was removed from his post, although he would continue to operate as a stalwart Democrat apparatchik for the remainder of his life. The leaking of this memo effectively short-circuited any hopes of imitating their prior patterns for acquiring new land, and especially Cuba. Although Cuba was still not safe, in fact, neither were any Latin American countries. The Democrat Party came to financially support and publicly support and politically recognize numerous excursions by, essentially mercenaries into Latin American countries with the intent of overthrowing existing systems of government and instituting slavocracies of sorts, which that will be covered in episode 21, dealing with a number of smaller issues that still relate directly and overlap in some cases to kind of these three peak events that illustrate the pro-slavery sentiment of the Democratic Party that had effectively evolved under Calhounism, away from simply protecting slavery in their own states to forcing slavery into new regions and into new territories, first through violence, subterfuge, attempts at purchase, annexation, and even the instigation of wars.